Hey guys, welcome to Ben Wrenchin. My name's Ben, and today I'm wrenching on my 94 Chevy K1500. I'm going to be replacing the rear bumper. Mine's got some pretty big holes in it, and I got this new bumper off Amazon. It was just under $200, but it came with all the brackets and even some of the hardware that I'm going to need. So I'm going to get started taking this old one off, and we'll see how hard it is to get off of here. Just judging by the hardware that came with this new bumper, they gave me 4 bolts and nuts that are 14 millimeters and 6 bolts and 4 nuts. These are 15 millimeter bolts and 18 millimeter nuts. I don't know why there's only 4 nuts, but I guess we'll find out when we get under there. So I'm probably at least going to be taking that many off so that I can replace them with these new ones. I know that one of these brackets bolts onto the frame and the other one slides into the frame and bolts onto the bumper. So we'll get under there and get those brackets off and make sure we have that many nuts and bolts that we take off. Before I get started, one of the first real problems I know I'm going to run into is reattaching this electrical connection for a trailer. I've got a solution for that, so I'm hoping that's going to work, but I know that that's probably going to be a problem. I wanted to try to just disconnect all this and remove it. The problem with that is it's wired into the brake lights and the turn signals, and I really don't want to mess with all that. I would like to get it out of here, but I don't really know what I'm doing with all that, so I may just leave it in and reattach this to the new bumper. So underneath there is one of the brackets that we got, and that bracket attaches up here to the other bracket that we got that's going to attach to the bumper. Here are the nuts and bolts that we're going to replace. So there's 2 here, and then also 2 here, and it looks like both of those have nuts on the other side. So that is 8 of the 10, and then also these here. So I think that's all the bolts we're taking off. Like I said, we'll figure it out once we start getting it off. Get this bracket off, get those off, and see if it'll come off. So this is the other side, same thing. 2 bolts there, 2 bolts there, and 1 right here. I'm going to start by removing this electrical harness. We've got 2 10mm wrenches. One is on the bolt on the top, and the other one is a ratcheting 10mm wrench that I'm going to use to get this nut off. And for whatever reason, the bolt and nut on the other side is 11mm. Alright, and that broke off, which is fine, because we're going to replace those nuts and bolts anyway. So now I can finish taking this side off. And there's a ground attached to it, so we'll make sure we remember that when we put it back on. Alright, there we go. And hopefully I'll find a solution to attach it to the new bumper. I don't want to drill holes like this, and I think I've got a solution where I can use some metal clamps and clamp it on the new bumper right here. So we'll figure that out once we get the new one on, but for now I'll just set this aside. Alright, so the bolts for the brackets all feel like 18mm, so I grabbed a couple 18mm sockets. Got a deep socket, and I'm probably going to use my impact, but I will try to show you how to do it if you don't have an impact. Also got these shallow sockets. I got this whole socket set for pretty cheap, so I'll link all those in the description too. But first I'm going to use some PB Blaster and soak all those nuts and bolts down before I try to take them off. Alright, I got all the bolts soaked in PB Blaster. I've got an 18mm socket on the nut on this side, and I've got my hand on the other side to feel the head of the bolt, and I can turn this nut and the head doesn't move. So I'm going to loosen this up as much as I can until the bolt starts turning, and then I'll have to grab onto it on the other side and get this all the way off. Alright, so now the head of the bolt is starting to turn, so I'm going to get a wrench on the other side. So I actually don't have an 18mm wrench, but I do have these short sockets, and they fit into a 22mm wrench. So I'm going to use that to grab the head of the bolt on the other side. I needed the long socket on this side to reach back there. So I put my ratcheting wrench with the long socket on the head of the bolt, and then I've got the short 18mm socket with the 22mm wrench on the end of the nut there. And I'm able to get it loose, and I'll probably be able to get it out, so I just wanted to show you my setup. All right, there's the nut, and there's the bolt. So that one wasn't too bad. And now I'll try the same thing on the top one. I'm gonna loosen that nut until the bolt starts spinning. So I just broke it loose with a breaker bar, and I'll put it back on my ratchet and try to keep loosening it until the head starts spinning. There we go. Same setup, short socket on the nut on the outside, and my long socket on the head of the bolt. Really do wish I could just delete all this wiring so that I wouldn't have it all in the way, because I don't want to keep it anyway. If you have all this going on, you should really disconnect the battery so you don't take the chance of getting shocked by all of this excellent professional work that was done on the wiring here. So if it keeps getting tighter, reverse it and just tighten it back down a little bit. And try to loosen up some of that rust. And then flip it back and try to loosen it again. Alright, so I finally got that one loose. I've got the long 18mm socket with a ratcheting wrench on the head of the bolt. And over here I smashed a 17mm short socket onto the nut, and I've got a 22mm short socket because those have hex on the back and they're all 22mm. So I was able to use that and get this loose. So now I'm able to turn it just a little bit, get my ratchet to click once, and just keep turning it little by little. And eventually I'll get this all the way off. This bolt really just feels like it's going to snap at any minute, but hopefully I can just get the whole thing off. We'll go ahead and try my impact one more time and see how this goes. I've got it on the lowest setting, but this is how I stripped the nut last time. Alright, so there we go. Now the nut's loose and I can get it all the way off. Push this bolt through. There we go. There is a ground attached here. I'm going to go ahead and take that off too. For that last bolt on top of that bracket, I've got a 13mm socket on this side. It goes through to that top bolt on the shackle hanger, and that is a 15mm bolt, so I'm able to get that one out. Here's what it looks like on the other side. You've got the two large bolts that I just took out on that side, and then you've got that small 13mm nut up there. But that is how I'm getting that 13mm nut off on this side. I've got my ratcheting wrench over here and a 15mm socket over here. So I'm going to turn it until that gets wedged up against that shackle hanger. Since that 13mm nut is rounded off, I've got a rounded nut extractor. It's got some teeth on it and it'll grab onto it, and I'll be able to get it off with that. Good thing about these is they also have a hex on the back side. It is a 19mm, so I can put my 19mm socket on my nut extractor and I'll be able to get it out that way. So it's nice to have a set of these on hand for things like this, so I will link the set that I have in the description. It's pretty cheap. So the way this works, you just get it onto the nut. Normally it's best to hammer it on there to get it to bite down on it as best you can, but sometimes you can just force it on there without having to hammer it. Once you start turning, it'll start grabbing it, so that may actually be good. So I'm gonna try that. Alright, I finally got this off. So I used a nut extractor. I think this is a 1/2 inch. A 13 was too big, and 1/2 inch is just a little bit smaller than 13mm. So I used that on the nut side. This nut was pretty rounded, and I had a real difficult time getting this on there. I actually found that non-swivel head socket works better. The swivel head socket was letting this rock around too much and it would slip off of the nut. So that's the first time I've ever seen a straight ratchet work better than a swivel head. But I did get the nut off, so I will link these in the description. These are great. They've gotten me out of quite a few binds. It took me quite a while to get that off. I want to say probably 20 minutes to a half hour messing with it, trying different things. I tried some vice grips, some small wrenches. It's just difficult to get up in there, so I kind of threw everything I had at it. But the good news is it's out of there, and we'll see how difficult these are going to be. So I'm going to soak them in PB Blaster again and take a break and let that soak in, and hopefully they'll be easier than the other side was. I'm going to start with this small bolt first because I already had everything out from taking it off last on the other side. But I hammered on a 13mm socket. It's one of those short sockets. And I'm going to put a 22mm socket on the end of it and hopefully get that to turn. So I'm going to start with that one on this side. Alright, that one was way easier. Alright, so maybe I just got lucky, but this one doesn't look as bad as the other one. Alright, so the nut on the other side is rounded off, so I'm gonna brush it off with a wire brush, and I may need to use an 18mm nut extractor. Alright, I brushed that nut off with a wire brush, and I also put a 17mm socket on this nut side, and it actually fits way better, so it's probably actually a 17mm nut, and that's why the 18 was slipping off. So I've still got the breaker bar with an 18mm socket on this side, and then my ratcheting wrench with a 17mm socket on this side. And it's getting stuck, so I'm gonna back it off and go the other way, and just kind of keep working it back and forth. Hopefully knock some of that rust loose. So I've got that pry bar wedged up against the frame. Make sure your sockets are seated real well. And I'm just gonna go real slow and hope that nothing slips or rounds off. So I know the bolt is free because as I turn these, the bolt turns. So that's good news. The bolt's not seized in there. So I'll just tighten it down a little bit, try to loosen up some of that rust. Go this way. And go back the other way. Alright, using the impact, I basically stripped out this nut. It's the 17mm nut, so I put a 17mm nut extractor on it. This one actually uses a 24mm hex on the back side, but I'm just going to hammer this on. And then I've got a 24mm short socket. You want to go slow at first while it's biting into the head of the nut, and then it should get easier. Once it grabs on, it is on there. Alright, so now it's getting easier. Whenever you're pushing real hard, it's always best to pull, but since I can't pull in this position, I'm going to push. But it's best to open up your hands and make it so that if you slip, you're not going to crash your knuckles on something. So that's the best way to do it when something's real tight like that. Alright, and that one's loose. Alright, there we go. So usually if you tighten the screw back on, it'll bust it out back the other way. If it doesn't, you can just set both your sockets on tight and then just tighten it back up until it breaks free. And if you have to, throw it down on the ground or put it in a vise and knock it out. Yeah, same thing with this one. It's already slipping, so I'm gonna have to use the bolt extractor. There we go. So this is a 17mm bolt extractor. It's got a 24mm hex on the back side. Used a 24mm socket, and this bolt is a 19mm. Also at the bottom of this bracket, there's a bolt right here. It's an 18mm bolt. We're gonna have to take those off. It's got a welded nut on the actual bracket, so we don't have to grab the nut, but we will have to take that bolt off. And there's one on each side. So there's another one on this side. So we'll take both of those off. Alright, I soaked these in PB Blaster also. When you use the 18mm socket, and I'm gonna use a small extension on my long pry bar and see if I can get it without using an impact. Get it seated on there real well before I start. Yes, my impact is broken. I've been trying to use it with just the one side. Still good. Now that I've broken it loose, I'm gonna use a ratcheting socket to loosen it the rest of the way. All right, I am not that patient. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I would recommend being careful. This should be the last bolt holding the bumper on, so you just want to make sure you're not under it in case it falls after you get this bolt out. And with all of those bolts out, the bumper is loose. And how do I know it's loose? Well, there's a huge gap in between the tailgate and the bumper. So I know it dropped down a little bit. I'm gonna slide it backwards and just get that bracket out of the frame, and it should come right off. A lot of people said you could just lift up the bumper and pull it out, but this right here is getting caught on this part of the bed, and I can't lift it any more than that to slide it out. So the good news is there's only 4 bolts that I need to take off to get this bumper off of these brackets that slide into the frame. The bad news is mine are pretty rusty. They have nuts on the other side, so I'm gonna have to wrestle with that. But once I get these 2 and the 2 on the other side off, then I will be able to take the bumper off of these brackets and then get the brackets out. So if you feel like you're going through an entire can of PB Blaster on this job, you're not the only one. All right, 18mm sockets on both sides. All right, there's one. So this is a good time to remind you to take the light bulb out of the license plate light bulb socket. Since that was still attached, I took both of those out. There's one right there too. So take both of those out before you go pulling on the bumper. So that has everything disconnected at this point. Here's the setup I got for that top bolt. On this side, I've got a 16mm bolt extractor, 24mm socket on the end of it with my ratcheting wrench on this side. And on this side, I've got an 18mm short socket, a ratcheting extension for my pry bar to make it a little easier on me. But that is allowing me to bite onto the nut with the bolt extractor, get one click on my ratcheting pry bar extension, and loosen up this bolt little by little. So I'm going to keep doing that and get this bolt out. Alright, I did get that bolt out, so I'm going to show you what I did. 18mm short socket on the bolt side, and I used a ratcheting pry bar on that side. And then I had a straight pry bar on the side of the nut that was all chewed up with a 16mm bolt extractor, because I could get a 16mm socket on there, and then after a while it was just not catching. So I put the 16mm bolt extractor on it. It's got a 24mm hex, so I put that in there, and then I wedged that up against the bed, and I was able to ratchet it just like one click at a time with this thing. And then when I got it loose enough, I switched to my 1/2" drive ratcheting socket and got it out the rest of the way. So that's how I got that off, and that is all the rust that poured out of it once I got it out. So that thing was rusty, but these bolt extractors are coming in handy. All right, the last two bolts are back here. So the top one's pretty chewed up too, but I'll see if I can get that off with the bolt extractor. So the top one I was able to hammer on a 17mm socket with a breaker bar. And then I've got my long breaker bar with the ratcheting extension and an 18mm socket on this side. And it's actually coming out pretty easy. So this one wasn't bad. Same thing with this bottom one, except it's 18mm bolts on both sides. So I've got 18mm socket with a breaker bar on that side and my long breaker bar with a ratcheting extension and 18mm short socket on this side. And this one's turning pretty easily too. So this is the last bolt that is holding the bumper on. So I'm going to be really careful not to let the bumper fall on me when I get this bolt out. But it's coming out pretty easy. There we go. Last bolt is out, and now the bumper comes off. There we go. All right, old bumper off and new bumper matches. Same size and everything. And it sure looks a whole heck of a lot better. I took the brackets out and blew it off. So now I'm just gonna go in there with a wire brush and clean up some of this rust, and I'm gonna paint it just to try to prevent rust in the future since I'm not replacing anything here. Can't really tell if this is grease or dirt, but it has got a layer of black stuff caked on it. So I'm gonna clean that up before I paint. Brush off some of these ground connections. I'm gonna use some isopropyl alcohol to spray it off and clean it to prepare it for painting. I need some black rust stop paint. It says no primer needed. I don't have a lot of this, so I'm not gonna go crazy, but I do wanna kind of cover these surfaces so I can stop as much rust as possible back here while I'm in here. Try to get some of these harder to reach places while I'm back here, and I got the bumper off. Alright, so that should be pretty good. I got pretty much everything I won't be able to see once I get the bracket back on. And I'm running low on paint, so I don't want to go ahead and paint this whole thing. I can always come back and hit some of this underneath stuff that I can reach even with the bumper on. So I think that's going to be good for now. I'm going to let this dry and then do the same thing to the other side. Got the old bumper matched up with the new one, same size and everything. Everything looks identical, so that is really good news. These are all the bolts I took off in order. So real quick, this was the bracket inside the truck, and it had these two bolts right here. This smaller bolt was up here, and this bolt here was coming in underneath into this welded nut on the bracket. And then these two screws were holding on the bumper to the bracket right here. So that's all the screws I took off to get the bumper off. This is more screws than what my new bumper came with. So these are all the screws that the new bumper came with. I went to the hardware store and got more that are the exact same size because there was only two sizes of screws that I took off, and I need some of these to attach the bumper to these brackets that are still attached on my old bumper. So I will need more screws. I went ahead and got some more at the hardware store. These smaller screws are 3/8-16, and the larger ones were M12-175. I got screws that were a little bit longer than the ones that were sent in my kit, so I don't think that should be a problem, but I've got plenty of screws here to start getting everything reattached. So I got the frame sanded and painted, and I gave it time to dry. So the first thing I'm going to do is attach the brackets in here, because these have to turn sideways in order to get them in here. Some people said that you could lift this bracket out with the bumper attached and it would fit through, but there is no way to get this through here without turning it. So I will attach these first. The smaller screw is going to go through the shackle hanger on the outside, and I'll put the nut on the inside. Next, I'm going to feed one of the larger screws that came with my bumper up under to this welded nut to get it set in place. So my old one still got that attached, and there's one bolt up here with a nut on the back, and then this bolt here has a welded nut on the bracket. So that's why I got a bolt with no nut, but I'm just going to use some of the hardware that I got. But you'll definitely want to get extra bolts and nuts for this if you take yours off and you want to replace some of the ones that you took off if they look rusty like mine did. So I'm going to attach the new bracket to the new bumper, the same that this one looks. I just set the old one back there and got the new one right here just for comparison. So I'll go ahead and get this one started, and then that will help me line this one up too. I'm going to use one of the longer screws to attach this that I bought, and put one of these cap nuts on the other side. One of the bad things about buying hardware from the hardware store is the heads are different sizes. So these are the same size bolt. This is the one I got at the hardware store. It's a 19mm head. And this one that came with the bumper is a 15mm head. So I've got all different size bolts going into this thing, which is annoying, but it's manageable. So at this point I noticed that I can add in these license plate light covers, and the old ones have a retaining clip that I'm gonna have to transfer from the old bumper to the new one. So I'm gonna do that. I've also got this grommet for the place to stick the tool through to get to the spare tire. Mine doesn't have the spare tire on it, but this grommet here is going to need to go on here, so I'll have to transfer that too. But I think that's about all I'm going to have to transfer over is the license plate light retaining clips and the grommet. This angle was pretty hard to replicate, but I got as close as I could. I'll tighten all this down once I get it on and get everything straight. These are still pretty loose, and as I tighten one of them, the other one gets looser. That one's got a cap nut on the back of it, so that's going to make it even more difficult to tighten that down. But I don't want to do it now because it'll probably give it some angle that I don't want, and I want to be able to get everything on loose and then tighten it up after I make sure the bumper is straight. So that's my plan right now. I'm going to go ahead and put the bracket on the other side, and then I'll be ready to get the bumper onto the truck. I've got both brackets on loose onto the bumper and both of the brackets on the back of the truck. The license plate light bulb housing, I'm just going to make sure that this part is facing towards the license plate. It looks like they're the same for both sides, so it doesn't really matter which side you put it in. I'll try some pliers to get the retainer clip off. And I'll just transfer it over to the new one. Same thing with this one. And then I'll just take this grommet out to put it over here. I'm gonna use a pick to try to get under it because this one is pretty old and crusty. It's like I'm gonna have to push it through this side, out the front of the bumper. There we go. So you do want to push this out the front. The front has a larger lip than the back does. So I'm going to put it in the same way. I'm going to go in from the front with the smaller lip towards the back. Mine is pretty old and not pliable, so it's a little difficult. I'll see if I can find a new one and link it in the description. There we go. So that's in there. So that's all that I need to transfer over. I'm gonna hold on to these old light covers because these are silver. The ones that I put on are black. I'll decide which ones I like better. I'm probably gonna leave the black ones, but I'll hold on to these just in case I like the way these look better. And with all that switched over, I'm ready to attach the bumper to the brackets. So I've got the one bolt in the back and then also the bolt that goes into the threaded nut on the bracket. The other two bolts are going to go through here, and the bracket for the bumper is going to go on the other side. So I'm going to bring the bumper up, have a friend hold one side, I'll hold the other side, and I'll get the bolts through on the sides. Again, here's all the bolts that I'm using. I got these larger bolts from the hardware store with these cap nuts. I got these large washers. I think these are 3/8 washers, meaning the inside hole is 3/8 of an inch. So I put those on the head side of these bolts. The cap nut has enough surface area that I don't need one on that side. And any of the bolts that I have that don't have a cap on them, I'm putting one of these large washers just for extra integrity. I needed a quick solution for my two ground wires to this whole wiring mess. Back here, the old ones were attached right here, but since this is painted, I'm not going to get a good ground connection. I noticed this hole right here, so I found a nut and a bolt. The bolt will fit through here. I'm going to tighten those ground wires down here and make sure that I've still got a good ground connection. So I'm going to brush this with a wire brush and get some exposed metal here, and I should have a good ground connection there. So I just used some low grit sandpaper and scuff that up to expose the metal. I'll get those ground wires attached there and then maybe paint over it so it doesn't get rusted. So I'll put this bolt through both of these ground connections. I'll put a washer on the back side. And this nut will go on the back side too. I've got a 13mm wrench on the nut on the back, and I'm just trying to hold these ground wires where I want those to be and tighten this bolt down. All right, so that should be good. I'll just have to make sure I don't pinch these wires when I put the bumper on. I do have some silver spray paint that I'm going to use just to paint over this. Make sure it doesn't rust where I exposed all that metal. All right, hopefully that should be good enough. So to get the bumper on, I'm going to slide the side brackets and put the bolts through here. I've still got this bolt and this bolt holding on the bracket. Those are loose, but I'll be able to get the bracket on the bumper up here, get these bolts through, and then the other two bolts are going to go right here. One side bolted in. Just gotta do the same to the other side. Got all the bolts in, now I can tighten them down. So I'm ready to start tightening some of these bolts up. I'm going to start with these that go into the welded nut on the bracket because I know that that's going to be flush. I want to get everything lined up right. So I feel like this is a good place to start. Next, I'll tighten these bolts that go into the welded nut on the bracket on the bumper. And do the same on this side. So I started to tighten up the bolts a little bit and I noticed the bumper was sagging towards the back. So as I tightened the bolts, what I did is I put a work stool on my jack and I had to put a 2x4 to get some extra room. But that way I could rest that on the bumper and lift it up and get it level. That way I can tighten the bolts with the bumper lifted up as high as I want it. So that worked for me. It's a little redneck, but this is going to help me to get the bumper on straight. Could also have a buddy lift up on the back of the bumper while you tighten these bolts. But this is what I did and seems to be okay. So I've got a wrench on the nut back here and I'm just tightening up the head of this bolt. I've got a wrench on the nut on the back and I'm just tightening up this bottom bolt. And that's about as tight as I can get that one. For this top one, I can't get a wrench on the nut on the back, so I'm using an 18mm socket on a 3/8 to 1/2 adapter so that I can use my half drive socket. Wrench is on this side. I can use this smaller one and get it up in here where my wrench can't reach. Alright, and that's about as tight as I can get that one. So that one's good. This was a bolt that I got at the hardware store. It's got a 19mm nut on the back side that I'm using this short socket with. And then this side's got a 19mm long socket. Be nice if this stool wasn't in the way, but it's working. And now I need to switch sockets because the bolt is coming through on the nut on the other side. And it's falling out of my socket. So I'm gonna put the long socket on the nut side. And that as tight as I can get it. For this last one, I know it's an 18mm nut on the back. So I've got my 3/8 ratchet with a 3/8 to 1/2 adapter and my long 18mm socket for the nut side. And that bolt's a 15mm. So I will tighten this one down. Alright, and that one's as tight as I can get it. So I've got all these tightened down, the two holding the two brackets together. The two up here holding this bracket to the frame. So the last one I need to do is that small one up top. If I could do all this over again, I would just buy all hardware the same size. That way you don't have to keep switching sockets because that's pretty annoying. I'm just using some that I had on hand, some that I got at the hardware store, and some that came in the kit. But they're basically all the same size bolts except for that one at the top is a little bit smaller. So for all these bolts, including these on this side of the bracket, I would just grab all the same hardware so that it's all the same size. So I'll tighten that one up and this whole side will be done, and I'll move over to the other side and do the same thing. So for this top one, since everything else was tightened down, I went ahead and took the jack and the stool out to give me enough room to get to this one. So same thing, I've got a socket on the back and a socket on this side. So I've got that one about as tight as I can get it. And I did the same thing on this side. I jacked it up to get it level, and then I tightened all these bolts. So just make sure after you tighten all these down that you go back through and tighten them down again. So as I worked my way out, so I started back here, tightened everything down, and then when I came back around to here, I could tighten these down quite a bit more. So just make sure you go back through and tighten everything up again after you've already done it once. So nothing exciting to report on this side, but I did go ahead and tighten all these down. So I'm ready to get the light harness in for the license plate lights and button up a few more things and we'll be done. So since the new bumper came with a new wiring harness for the license plate lights, I'm going to go ahead and use this one since it's brand new. This is going to be really easy to install and it looks a little better than the one that was already on the truck. So in the middle of this mess, there is the plug for the license plate lights. So I'm going to start by plugging the light bulb that is closest to the wiring harness end into this side of the license plate lights, and then I'll run this across and plug this side in too. So I got that one in, and I'll get this one in as well. I like these because you just push them in and that little rubber piece just pushes right into that plastic housing. So that's all we need to do there. There were clips on my old harness that would push into these holes here so that you can run it up along here. I had a little bit of trouble getting them off, so I'm probably just going to order new ones and put those in once I get those. So for now I'm just going to leave this dangling. And now I can grab this wiring harness and just plug this in. So the side with the tab here is going to go on the side with the notch that sticks out so that that fits right into that tab. And it locks into place, and so that is connected and we're all good there. So as I'd promised, I knew that I would be able to find a way to attach this trailer hookup onto the bumper without having to drill holes and screw it in there. So I will show you how to do that next. So this is my idea. I knew I had some of these on hand. They're just little metal clamps that you twist this and it clamps down. So I can put one of these in between the bracket and the bumper. And I'll do the same on this side. And with those on there as tight as I can go, I feel like that's going to hold pretty well. So I'm good with it. I'm really not going to use this thing, so I kind of don't care if it falls, but even if it does, I got the wiring wrapped around this trailer hitch frame, so even if it falls down, it's only going to dangle right here for a little bit until I get it reattached. So I'm going to try that and hope that this will stay put. Feels pretty sturdy though. And from this side it looks pretty normal, so I think that is going to be good. So one last thing I'm going to do is put in these license plate retainer clips in the squares at the top of where the license plate goes. I got these in a pack that includes some screws for the license plate that fit into these, some of these, and some covers for the top of the screws. Everything that you get is right there in this kit. I'll link this kit in the description too. And these just pop right in here. There we go. And I guess there is only one last thing that I'd like to do. All right, there we go. It looks good. So with the license plate on, everything is done. I've tightened down every bolt, double checked everything, and I'm really happy with how it looks. So the biggest concern I have at this point is I think this bumper that I got on Amazon that's not an actual OEM bumper is not the best quality. So the first thing that I noticed when I got it on there is there's quite a bit of gap in the center of it, but as you get out to the sides, that gap closes. I don't like that. I'm gonna see what I can do to raise the center of the bumper. Maybe I can jack up the center the same way that I did the sides when I tightened them down. So I don't like that, but it's not huge. It's not super noticeable. And the new bumper definitely looks better than the old one did. So other than that, I like this bumper. I like that it came with some of the hardware that I needed. But I will link this bumper and some of the parts that I used, some of the tools that I used in the description below. With that though, we are done. So I appreciate you guys watching. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see some more content on my 94 Chevy K1500. So again, I appreciate you guys watching. I got some tools to clean up and then I am finished. I'm gonna back this thing in the garage and call it a day. And I will see you guys in the next video.